Absolutely. It certainly could. And we use scaling in this line of work. My colleagues and I, we use scaling a lot.
There is a Bitcoin wallet sitting somewhere right now. It has a balance. The balance is zero. And that single detail, that silence, is what 8 law enforcement professionals say breaks this entire case open. Follow me, because this is really strange. The wallet has been at zero through 2 separate deadlines, through 62 days of a family grieving in front of cameras, in front of the entire country, through 8 named, credentialed, verifiable investigators, not bloggers, not internet theorists, people who have sat across from actual kidnappers in federal interrogation rooms, people who understand how these crimes work from the inside. All of them looked at the same evidence. All. None of them arrived at the same place, and none of them believe this was a ransom kidnapping in any practical sense. But here's the problem. We are getting ahead of ourselves, and that is exactly the point. Mistake most coverage of this case has made from the beginning. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She came home one evening, like she had done hundreds of times before. A little tired, maybe. She had spent time with her children. She went to bed. Somewhere between 1:47 in the morning and 2:28 in the morning, 41 minutes. Something happened. Her phone went active at 1:47. By 2:28, it was silent. Not dead, not lost, silent. And when her family realized she was gone, what they found at the front of that house was not the scene of a panicked opportunist. There was blood on the front step. There was a ring camera torn from the wall, not smashed in place, not knocked sideways in a struggle. Removed, deliberately. That detail changes everything. A burglar who panics grabs what he can and runs. He does not stop. To pull a camera off a wall, that takes time. That takes thought. That takes someone who understood, before they ever set foot on that property, that the camera was a problem. And the moment you accept that, the moment you understand that, someone planned around that camera, you are no longer looking at a crime of opportunity. You are looking at something else entirely. This is where things start to feel off. 8 law enforcement professionals reviewed this case, not casually, professionally. Harry Trombitus, a former FBI special agent, told Yahoo News that the ransom motive was becoming less and less credible with every passing day. His exact reasoning was simple: too much exposure, too many ways to get caught. Andrew Bringwell, a retired FBI special agent now working in private security consulting, went further. He drew a direct parallel to a kidnapping he personally worked in Alabama in 1991, a case that had a ransom element, was treated as a ransom case for weeks, and ended in homicide before a single dollar ever changed hands. He was not theorizing. He was pattern matching against something he had lived. Court Dabb, a retired homicide detective from Pima County, the same jurisdiction where this crime occurred, said clearly, this was a coordinated operation, 2 to 4 people, pre-planned, pre-surveilled, with Nancy Guthrie as the specific chosen target. And then there is Morgan Wright, 18 years as a state trooper and detective, now running the National Center for Open and Cold Cases. He told investigators publicly that this case should no longer be treated as a missing persons investigation. He used a specific legal classification for what he believes this is: a homicide without a body. But something went wrong with the story the public was being told, because the story the public was being told was about a ransom. And the ransom, according to every one of these 8 professionals, was never the point. What happened next was unexpected. The family went public. They told the world they would pay. They showed the Bitcoin address. The entire country watched that wallet, and the wallet never moved. Not once, not a single transaction. And that silence, that complete, unbroken stillness, is either the most catastrophic mistake a kidnapper for profit has ever made, or it means something else. Something that changes the nature of this case entirely. What do you think actually happened here? Because the evidence keeps pulling in one direction, and it is not toward a ransom that just went uncollected. Think about the psychology of what we are looking at. When someone plans a crime, when they surveil a location, when they account for a camera, when they move in a group of 2 to 4 people in the middle of the night with a specific target in mind, that is not impulsive behavior. That is the behavior of someone who decided at some point before that night that Nancy Guthrie was worth the risk. Not her money, not a wallet, her. And when I sit with that thought, when I really let it settle, what I keep coming back to is this. The most frightening crimes are not the ones that happen without warning. They are the ones where someone spent time deciding. Someone watched. Someone waited. And whatever they were waiting for, it had nothing to do with Bitcoin. Something does not add up here. It never really did. And the question that stays with me, the one I cannot quite put down, is whether whoever did this was counting on the rest of us to keep looking at the wallet instead of asking why it was empty from the start. Notebook V. Thank you for being here tonight. This case is still open. The investigation has not ended. And I want to ask you something. Before you go, if the ransom was never real, what does that tell us about who had a reason to make it look like it was? There is something investigators call a targeted opportunistic crime. It sounds like a contradiction. Targeted means chosen. Opportunistic means accidental. But what it actually describes is something far more calculated than either word alone suggests. It means someone chose you long before the moment they took you. And then they waited for you to make one small mistake. One unlocked door. One night you came home a little more tired than usual. One moment where your guard was down because you had no reason to believe you needed a guard at all. That is what Court Dab believes happened here. And when you sit with that, when you really think about what it means for someone to watch a person long enough to know their routine, to know which entrance they use, to know which night they might forget to turn the latch, it stops feeling like a crime story. It starts feeling like something much darker because it means that whatever happened to Nancy Guthrie did not begin the night she disappeared. It began weeks before, maybe longer. But here is the problem. Most of the coverage around this case never got there. Most of the conversation stayed at the surface level. Was the ransom real? Would the family pay? Would the wallet move? And while the public was watching that wallet, the people who actually understand how these crimes operate were already asking a completely different set of questions. The first question was this. Who knew her well enough to know she was worth taking? Andrew Bringwell made something very clear when he referenced that 1991 Alabama case. The thing that connected both situations was not the method, it was the motive structure. In Alabama, the ransom demand came early. It looked credible. The family was told to wait. Investigators treated it as a live negotiation. And then weeks passed and nothing moved. And eventually the truth of what had actually happened could no longer be ignored. The ransom had never been the architecture of that crime. It had been the wallpaper. Something placed over the surface to make investigators look in one direction, while the real answer was somewhere else entirely. That is when things changed in how investigators approached this case. Because once you accept the possibility that the Bitcoin demand was not a collection mechanism, but a delay mechanism, once you allow yourself to consider that someone sent that demand not because they needed the money, but because they needed time, or needed the investigation pointed somewhere specific, the entire case rearranges itself. Every detail you thought you understood means something different now. The removed camera is not about avoiding identification. It is about controlling the timeline of discovery. The blood on. The step is not evidence of a struggle that got out of hand. It is a data point in a sequence that someone planned. The silence after. The deadlines passed is not the behavior of a kidnapper who got scared. It is the behavior of someone who was never waiting for a response in the first place. And what happened next was unexpected, because the more investigators leaned into this reframe, the more a specific word kept surfacing. Surveillance. Pre-surveillance, specifically. Court Dab used it directly. 2 to 4 people. Coordinated. They knew the property. They knew the schedule. They knew which window of time to use. You do not know those things about an 84-year-old woman unless you have been watching her. And you do not watch someone unless you have already decided they are the destination. This is where things start to feel off in a way that is difficult to explain but impossible to ignore. Think about what pre-surveillance requires. It requires patience. It requires discipline. It requires someone to stand at a distance, repeatedly, without acting, without rushing, until the conditions are exactly right. That is not the behavioral profile of someone motivated by financial desperation. A person who needs money does not wait weeks for the perfect night. A person driven by something else entirely, something more personal, something more specific. That person waits. That person is careful. That person removes the camera instead of smashing it because they are not panicking. They are executing. Morgan Wright's classification, homicide without a body, carries a legal weight that most people do not fully appreciate when they hear it. It is not a guess. It is not pessimism. It is a formal investigative posture that says the evidence available no longer supports the framework of a missing persons case. It says that trained professionals, looking at the totality of what is known, believe that what happened in those 41 minutes between 1:47 and 2:28 in the morning was not the beginning of a negotiation. It was an ending. But something still does not sit right, and it is the question underneath all the other questions. Not how, not when, not even who, exactly. The question that keeps surfacing, the one that 8 professionals with decades of combined experience are circling without being able to answer publicly yet, is why? Why, Nancy? Why this house? Why this night? Why go to the extraordinary operational effort of a multi-person coordinated an abduction of an 84-year-old woman if the goal was never the money sitting in that wallet? What do you think the answer to that question looks like? Because I have been sitting with it, and I keep arriving at the same uncomfortable place. The answer to why always lives closer to home than we want it to, not necessarily in the family. That is not what the evidence suggests, but in proximity, in relationship, in someone who knew enough to know that Nancy Guthrie specifically was the target worth all of that planning. And that thought, that someone in or around this story decided she was worth the risk of all of it, is the detail that changes everything about how you read what comes next. Savannah Guthrie is one of the most recognized faces in American morning television. She has spent years sitting across from presidents, from grieving families, from people in the middle of the worst moments of their lives. She knows, better than almost anyone, how to hold herself together in front of a camera. She knows what composed looks like. She knows what hopeful sounds like. She has delivered both professionally for a very long time. So when she sat down for her first public interview after her mother disappeared, people were watching her the way investigators watch a witness, not suspiciously, but carefully. And what they heard was not what they expected. She did not say she hoped her mother was safe. She did not say she was praying for her return. She said, "I know where she is. I know who she is with." Those were her words, not a wish, not a prayer, a statement of knowledge. And that distinction, that small grammatical gap between hoping and knowing, is the kind of detail that investigators and behavioral analysts notice immediately, even when the rest of the world moves past it. There is a language that people use when they are still inside the active hope of a situation. It reaches forward. It uses words like waiting and praying, and when she comes home. And then there is a different language, a quieter one. The language of someone who has already received information they are not yet able to share publicly. Information delivered in a conference room with FBI agents across the table. Information given in confidence, with the understanding that the public is not ready to hear it yet. That language does not reach forward. It settles. It uses words like knowing, like closure, like celebrating a life. This is where things start to feel off. 3 days before that interview, the family released a statement, and the phrasing of that statement, The specific word, choices, did not sound like a family still waiting for a phone to ring. It sounded like a family beginning to process something that had already ended. They spoke about celebrating Nancy's life, about honoring who she was. Those are not the words of people who believe a negotiation is still active. Those are the words of people who have been told quietly and carefully that the chapter has closed, even if the world has not caught up yet. But something about that gap between what the family appears to know privately and what the public record has confirmed is itself a data point. Investigators brief families, they share assessments, they prepare people for outcomes before those outcomes become official. And the language a family uses in public, even unconsciously, often reflects what they have already absorbed in private. Savannah's return to work on April 6th carries the same weight. She announced it herself. She framed it as purpose, as a way to keep her mother's name in the national conversation, to stay visible, to maintain pressure on whoever is out there and knows something. And that framing is not the behavior of someone who has moved on. It is the behavior of someone who has accepted a reality and decided that the most powerful thing she can do inside that reality is to keep showing up, to keep the name alive, to refuse to let the story go quiet. And that detail changes everything about how you read the family's public presence throughout this case. Because now you are not watching a family hoping for a different outcome. You are watching a family that has likely already been told the outcome and is now doing the only thing left available to them: keeping pressure on, staying in the frame, making sure that whoever did this cannot simply wait for the world to forget. What happened next was unexpected, because the more you look at the behavioral layer of this case, the more you realize that the family's public actions have been a kind of parallel investigation. Every appearance, every carefully worded statement, every interview, not grief performance, strategy. The sustained, exhausting, deliberate strategy of people who need the world to stay interested long enough for someone, somewhere, to finally say what they know. Morgan Wright said it plainly: this is a homicide without a body. And what that means in practice is that the investigation cannot close the way a family needs it to close. There is no confirmation. There is no location. There is no name attached to an arrest. There is only the evidence pointing in one direction, and a family holding that weight privately, while continuing to show up publicly and ask the same question in 100 different ways. Here is the thing that stays with me when I think about all of it. We talk a lot about the behavior of perpetrators in cases like this. We analyze the crime scene. We look at the video timeline. We ask who had motive and who had access and who knew the routine well enough to exploit it. And all of that matters. But there is another behavior worth examining: the behavior of people who absorb devastating private knowledge and then choose every single day to walk back into the light and keep asking. That takes something most of us will never be tested on. And the fact that Savannah Guthrie walked into that Today studio and sat down and answered questions with the name of the person she lost still open and unresolved. That is not composure. That is a different kind of fight entirely. Something does not add up about how quiet this case has been allowed to become in certain corners. 8 professionals reached the same conclusion: the wallet never moved. The timeline has a 41-minute gap that no official statement has ever fully explained, and a family that has likely been told more than they can say publicly is still out there, still showing up, still saying the name. The question I keep coming back to is simple. If someone out there knows what happened in those 41 minutes, and statistically, in a coordinated operation involving 2 to 4 people, someone does, what is keeping them quiet? Fear? Maybe. Loyalty to the wrong person. The belief that enough time has passed that silence is now the safer choice. But silence has a way of becoming its own kind of evidence. And the people who know that best are still watching, still waiting, still counting on the rest of us to keep asking. There is a version of this case that makes sense on the surface, an elderly woman, a home invasion, a ransom demand sent to a high-profile family with the resources to pay. A Bitcoin wallet address attached to a deadline. It is a clean story. It has a clear structure. It has a villain with an obvious motive and a family with an obvious next step. The problem is that not one piece of that story held together under pressure. And the moment you start pulling at the edges, the moment you ask, why a kidnapper with a financial motive would watch a wallet full of public attention and never touch it, the clean story starts to come apart. Not slowly, all at once. Because once the ransom falls apart as a real motive, everything built on top of it falls with it. The deadlines, the demands, the framework of a negotiation that was never actually a negotiation. This is where things start to feel off in a way that cannot be walked back. Andrew Bringwell put it in a way that has stayed with me since I first read it. He said the evidence points to an abduction that went wrong at the moment of capture, not an operation that broke down during negotiation, not a plan that unraveled when the FBI got involved. At the moment of capture, which means whatever the real outcome of this case is, whatever happened in those 41 minutes between 1:47 and 2:28 in the morning, it was likely already determined. Before the sun came up that day, before the family woke up, before anyone knew to start asking questions, that detail changes everything because it reframes the entire 62 days that followed. The public vigil, the press appearances, the tip lines and the reward money, and the FBI task force and the watched wallet. All of it unfolding over a timeline that, if Bringwell and the others are right, had already reached its conclusion in the dark before any of it began. And that is not a comfortable thought. It is the kind of thought that sits in the back of your mind and does not leave. But something else has been bothering me throughout this entire case. Something quieter than the Bitcoin wallet, something smaller than the removed camera or the blood on the step or the 41-minute gap in the timeline. It is the question of the ransom note itself, who it was written for, because a ransom note sent to a family like this, a family with a nationally recognized name, with media access, with the ability to put that Bitcoin address in front of millions of people within hours, is not a private communication. It is a public one, and public ransom demands are extraordinarily rare in real kidnapping-for-profit operations. Real operators avoid exposure. They communicate through burner phones and encrypted channels and indirect intermediaries. They do not send demands that they know will end up on the front page. So who writes a ransom note designed to be seen by everyone? Someone who needs the story to look a certain way. Someone who needs investigators focused on a wallet and a deadline, while something else, something that happened before the note was ever written, goes unexamined for as long as possible. That is the behavioral logic underneath the demand, not collection, misdirection. And if that reading is correct, then the person or people who planned this understood something fundamental about how investigations work and how public attention moves. They understood that a ransom narrative would dominate the first weeks. They understood that deadlines would create the illusion of an active negotiation. They understood that a watched wallet creates the appearance of a live situation long after the situation has already ended. And what happened next, or rather what did not happen, confirmed every one of those suspicions for the professionals watching this case. The deadlines passed. No contact, no escalation, no pressure applied, no new demand, no proof of life. In a real kidnapping-for-profit operation, when a deadline passes without payment, something happens. The kidnapper makes contact. They lower the demand. They send a warning. They apply pressure. They do something. Because their entire leverage depends on the family believing the person is still alive and retrievable. The moment that belief collapses, the money disappears with it. A financially motivated kidnapper cannot afford silence after a missed deadline. Silence is the one thing that kills their negotiating position entirely. But here the silence came, immediately, and it never broke. Morgan Wright's framing keeps returning to me at this point in the analysis. The idea that this should be classified as a homicide without a body. Because what that classification does, practically and legally, is it shifts the entire investigative posture. It stops asking where she is being held. It starts asking where she was taken and by whom and what their connection to her was. It moves the center of gravity away from the ransom and toward the relationship, away from the wallet and toward the motive that was never financial in the first place. And that shift from ransom investigation to targeted homicide investigation is the reframe that 8 professionals arrived at independently. 8 people who have never been in the same room together, looking at the same public evidence, arriving at the same place. That kind of convergence does not happen by accident. It happens when the evidence is pointing clearly enough in one direction that trained professionals cannot, in good conscience, look away from it. This is not a theory. It is a pattern. And patterns are what these investigators have spent their careers learning to read. Here is what I keep coming back to as a simple human observation. Not as an analyst, not as someone who has read every document in this case, but as someone who has spent time sitting with the details and trying to understand the shape of what happened. When a crime is organized enough to involve pre-surveillance, multiple participants, a specific target, a coordinated entry, a removed camera, and a constructed ransom narrative, that level of organization does not come from nowhere. It comes from someone who had a reason. A real one, not a financial one. The kind of reason that lives in personal history, in proximity, in something that connected whoever did this to Nancy Guthrie in a way that made her, specifically her, the answer to a question they had already decided to ask. I do not know what that reason is. The evidence has not closed that door yet, but the shape of it, the deliberate, patient, personal shape of it, is something that stays with you long after you put the case down. 8 professionals, 1 conclusion, a wallet that never moved, a timeline with a 41-minute silence at its center, a family that speaks the language of private knowledge while the public record remains open, and somewhere out there, 2 to 4 people who know exactly what happened in those 41 minutes and have chosen every single day since to stay quiet. The question is not whether someone knows. In an operation this coordinated, someone always knows. The question is what it would take for that person to decide that speaking is less dangerous than staying silent. And so far, through 62 days, through 2 deadlines, through 8 professional assessments, and a nationally watched Bitcoin address, the silence has been winning. Something does not add up. It never did. And the part that stays with me, the part I cannot put down, no matter how long I sit with this case, is that the person who designed that silence knew exactly what they were doing. They knew how investigations move. They knew where public attention would go. They knew that a watched wallet would keep everyone looking in one direction long enough for the truth to settle somewhere unreachable. That is not the behavior of someone who panicked. That is the behavior of someone who planned. And planning requires a reason, a real one, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that waits. Notebook V. Thank you for staying with this case and with this channel. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Not about the evidence, not about the timeline. Something simpler. If someone you knew was capable of this level of planning, this level of patience, this level of calculation, would you have seen it coming? Or would they have looked to you like anyone else? Think about that. And if you have any information related to the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, the Pima County Sheriff tip line is 520-351-4900. The FBI line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. The family is offering a reward. The FBI is offering $100 for information leading to her recovery or an arrest. Someone out there knows something. The only question left is whether. They are more afraid of being found than they are of being quiet. So far, the quiet is winning, but it never wins forever. There is one detail in this case that nobody has been able to explain away. Not the investigators, not the family, not the people who have spent weeks arguing that there is still A rational, innocent explanation for every piece of evidence that feels wrong. One detail that sits at the center of everything, refuses to move, no matter how many times you try to reframe it around it. The pacemaker went silent at 2:28 in the morning. Not the phone, not a security system, the pacemaker, a medical device implanted in the chest of an 84-year-old woman, designed to monitor and regulate her heart, transmitting data on a schedule, logging activity the way a black box logs a flight. It went silent at 2:28 a.m., and in the language of medical monitoring technology, silent does not mean off. Silent means no signal, and no signal from a pacemaker means one of a very limited number of things. None of them consistent with the woman who was taken alive and held somewhere waiting for a ransom to be paid. This is where things start to feel off in the most irreversible way, because everything else in this case can be argued around. The Bitcoin wallet could, theoretically, belong to a paranoid kidnapper who got scared and abandoned the plan. The removed camera could be explained as someone who panicked and made an unusual decision in the moment. The missed deadlines could be rationalized as a negotiator who overestimated their own leverage. None of those explanations are convincing to the professionals who have reviewed this case, but they are at least arguments. They are positions someone could take and defend. The pacemaker signal is different. A pacemaker does not go silent because a kidnapper got nervous. It does not go silent because the FBI got too close. It does not go silent because someone decided the ransom was too risky to collect. It goes silent when the body it is monitoring is no longer transmitting conditions that keep it active. And the timestamp on that silence, 2:28 a.m., exactly 41 minutes after the last known phone activity at 1:47, is not a coincidence that trained investigators are willing to set aside. Morgan Wright did not use the phrase homicide without a body casually. He used it because the evidence available, including the kind of physiological data that a pacemaker provides, pointed him and others toward a conclusion that the missing persons framework was no longer adequate to contain. And once you understand what the pacemaker data suggests, the rest of the case reorganizes itself around that center point with a kind of terrible clarity. But something about the way this detail was handled publicly has bothered me from the moment I first encountered it. It was not hidden. It was not suppressed. It was simply not emphasized. It existed in the reporting, available to anyone who was reading carefully enough, and it passed through the news cycle without receiving the weight it deserved. And that gap between the significance of the detail and the attention it received is itself worth examining. Because in an investigation like this one, the details that do not get emphasized are sometimes the most important ones. Not because of conspiracy, not because anyone is deliberately obscuring them, but because the news cycle moves fast and human attention follows the loudest signal. And the loudest signal in this case was always the Bitcoin wallet, the deadline, the family's public statements, the reward money, the watched address, all of it visible. All of it dramatic, all of it pointing toward a narrative of an ongoing negotiation that 8 professionals believe was never real. While the world watched the wallet, the pacemaker data sat in an evidence file and told a quieter story. And what happened next was that the professionals who understood what that data meant began to say so publicly. Not all at once, not in a coordinated statement. One by one, in interviews for different publications, using different language, but arriving at the same place. Harry Trombotis said the ransom motive was becoming less credible. Andrew Bringwell said the abduction went wrong at the moment of capture. Court Dabb said this was a targeted operation with a specific human objective. Morgan Wright said this should be classified as a homicide without a body. 8 people, 8 careers, 1 direction. And the direction was away from the ransom, away from the wallet, away from the negotiation that never happened, toward the 41 minutes, toward what the pacemaker logged, toward the question of who planned this and why and what. Their connection to Nancy Guthrie was before any of this began. This is the part of the case that the clean surface story was always designed to prevent you from reaching. Because if the ransom was misdirection, if the Bitcoin demand was wallpaper placed over the real architecture of this crime, then the real question was never where is the money going? The real question was always who needed this to look like something it was not. And that question does not point toward a stranger. It does not point toward a random opportunist who happened to notice an unlocked door. It points towards someone with enough knowledge of this family, this property, this woman's routine, to construct a narrative sophisticated enough to dominate a 62-day national news cycle. That level of construction requires intimacy with the target. Not necessarily personal intimacy, but proximity, knowledge, the kind of understanding of a person's life that you do not acquire from the outside looking in. And that thought, sitting with it honestly, without rushing toward a conclusion the evidence has not yet confirmed, is the most unsettling place this case leads. Not the crime scene, not the timeline, not even the pacemaker signal. The most unsettling place is the recognition that whoever did this knew enough about Nancy Guthrie to know that she was the answer to whatever question they were asking. And they knew enough about how investigations work to build a story designed to keep everyone looking somewhere else while the real answer settled into silence. The wallet was never going to move. The deadlines were never going to produce contact. The negotiation was never going to happen because there was no negotiation. There was only a plan, and the plan was completed in 41 minutes. In the dark, while an 84-year-old woman who had done nothing more dangerous than come home tired and forget to lock a door became the target of something that had been decided long before that night. I want to sit with something for a moment before we close this out. Not an investigative point, not a piece of evidence, something more personal than that. When we talk about crimes like this, targeted, planned, patient crimes, we tend to focus on the mechanics, the timeline, the evidence, the behavioral profile of the perpetrators, and all of that matters. But there is something else worth naming. Something about what it means to be chosen. Nancy Guthrie was not a symbol. She was not a case study. She was a person who raised children who love her, who went to bed on an ordinary night, who had no reason to believe that someone had spent weeks learning her routine for a purpose she would never have imagined. And whatever happened in those 41 minutes, whatever the pacemaker data suggests, whatever the professionals believe, whatever the evidence points toward, it happened to her, a specific person with a specific life, and that life deserved to end on its own terms, in its own time. Not in 41 minutes in the dark because someone decided she was useful to their plan. That is the thing about targeted crimes that the forensic language sometimes struggles to hold. The target was a person first. Everything else came after. 8 professionals, 1 conclusion. A pacemaker that went silent at 2:28 in the morning. A wallet that never moved. A family still showing up. Still saying the name, still keeping the pressure alive in the only way left available to them. The investigation is not over. The people who know what happened in those 41 minutes are still out there. And somewhere between the silence of that wallet and the silence of that pacemaker signal is the truth of what this case actually was from the beginning. Something does not add up. It never did. And the question that stays open, the one that does not close, no matter how long you sit with this, is whether the person who built that silence ever truly believed it would hold forever. Notebook V. Thank you for watching, for staying with this case and refusing to let it go quiet. I want to ask you one thing before you go. Not about the evidence, not about the timeline, but about something simpler. When you think about the 41 minutes, when you really sit inside that window of time and think about what the data suggests happened there, what does your instinct tell you? Not your analysis, your instinct. Because sometimes the thing that does not add up is not a detail. Sometimes it is the whole story. And sometimes the whole story was designed from the beginning to make sure you never quite reached the question that mattered most. If you have any information related to the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, the Pima County Sheriff tip line is 520-351-4900. The FBI line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. The family is offering a reward, and the FBI is offering $100 for information leading to her recovery or to the arrest of anyone involved. Someone out there knows something. The only question is whether they are ready to say it. 62 days is a long time to hold something together. It is a long time to wake up every morning and not have an answer. A long time to watch a tip line and a Bitcoin address and a national news cycle and feel the story slowly losing its grip on public attention, the way all stories eventually do. Not because the case is resolved, not because the questions have been answered, but simply because the world moves and attention is finite, and there is always another story arriving to replace the one that came before. The Guthrie family understood that. They understood it early. And the way they responded to it, the strategy they built around staying visible, staying vocal, refusing to let the silence expand, is itself one of the most revealing behavioral layers in this entire case. But here's the problem. Staying visible has a cost, and that cost is different for a family that knows more than they can say than it is for a family that is genuinely waiting for information. Because when you already know, when the FBI task force has sat across from you in a conference room and walked you through what the evidence suggests, and what the pacemaker data indicates, and what 8 independent professionals have concluded, staying visible is not hope. It is endurance. It is the exhausting, daily decision to keep showing up in a public space and performing the version of this story that the investigation still needs the world to believe is open. Savannah Guthrie returned to work on April 6th. She sat back down at the desk she has occupied for years. She smiled at cameras. She interviewed guests. She did the work of morning television, the relentless, optimistic, forward-moving work of a format that does not pause for grief, that does not accommodate ambiguity, that asks you to show up ready and present, regardless of what you are carrying privately. And she did it, because keeping her name in the national frame meant keeping her mother's name in the national frame, because visibility is leverage. Because the moment a family goes quiet is the moment the people responsible for a crime feel the pressure begin to lift. That detail changes everything about how you read her public presence throughout those 62 days. This was never grief performance. This was a campaign. A sustained, disciplined, carefully managed campaign to keep one question alive in the minds of enough people that eventually someone, one person, somewhere, who knows something and has been sitting with that knowledge for 2 months would feel the weight of it become unbearable. And what happened next was something that rarely gets named directly in coverage like this. The campaign worked in one sense and has not yet worked in the most important one. It kept the story alive. It kept the reward money visible. It kept the FBI's involvement in the national conversation. It prevented the case from sliding into the quiet category of unsolved disappearances that receive a paragraph every 6 months and nothing more. But it has not yet produced the thing the family actually needs: the confirmation, the location, the arrest that would allow them to do what the Instagram statement said they wanted to do: celebrate Nancy's life and bring her home. Those two things, the name of the person responsible and the physical confirmation of what happened, are the only things that close this case in any meaningful sense. And without them, the family exists in a particular kind of limbo that has no clean language to describe it. They know enough to grieve. They do not yet have what they need to finish grieving. And every public appearance, every carefully worded statement, every return to a television desk that must feel impossibly ordinary given what they are carrying, all of it is oriented toward collapsing that distance between private knowledge and public confirmation. This is where things start to feel off about the broader narrative surrounding this case, because the story the public has been following, the story of a ransom demand and a Bitcoin wallet and missed deadlines and a family. Waiting was always a simplified version of something far more complicated. The real story was never about whether the money would move. It was about what the money was designed to obscure. And the real investigation was never about negotiating with a kidnapper. It was about identifying someone who understood enough about this family, this woman, this property, to build a false narrative sophisticated enough to delay that identification for as long as possible. 62 days is a long time, but it is not forever. And the architecture of misdirection that was built around this case, the wallet, the deadlines, the ransom framework has a shelf life. Evidence accumulates, witnesses reconsider. People who have been sitting with knowledge they believed was safe to keep begin to understand that silence is not the same thing as protection, that the people who planned this carefully enough to remove a camera and construct a ransom narrative and coordinate 2 to 4 participants and execute a 41-minute window in the dark are not people who share what they know equally. And in operations involving multiple participants, the weakest point is always the same. It is the person who knew the most and trusted the wrong people to stay quiet. Something does not add up about how long that silence has held, because statistically, and the professionals who have worked these cases will tell you this directly, coordinated crimes involving multiple participants do not stay sealed indefinitely. Someone talks to someone. Someone makes a decision that creates a record. Someone feels the weight of what they know become heavier than the risk of saying it. And when that happens, when the architecture of silence develops its first crack, everything built on top of it becomes available. The investigation knows this. The FBI task force working this case knows this. And the family, who has been briefed on the progress of that investigation in ways the public has not been, knows this too. Which is perhaps why Savannah's language in that Today interview carried the particular quality it did. Not the language of someone waiting for a resolution, the language of someone waiting for a confirmation of something they have already been told is coming. But something about the timeline of public attention concerns me, not the investigative timeline, the public one. Because cases like this depend on a particular kind of sustained pressure that is genuinely difficult to maintain in a media environment that moves the way this one does. The Bitcoin wallet gave the story a visual anchor. The deadlines gave it a clock. The family's public presence gave it a human face. But all of those elements have a natural expiration. The wallet has been at zero for too long to generate daily headlines. The deadlines have passed without drama, and even a family as media-savvy as the Guthries cannot manufacture news from nothing. What remains? What has always remained underneath the noise of the ransom narrative is the evidence itself. The pacemaker data, the 41-minute window, the behavioral profile of a coordinated, pre-surveilled, targeted operation. The convergent conclusions of 8 independent professionals. Those things do not expire. They do not lose their meaning because a news cycle moved on. They sit in evidence files and investigative reports, and they wait for the moment when the case reaches the stage where they become the foundation of something the public can finally hear officially. And that moment, whenever it arrives, will reframe everything that came before it. Every press conference, every statement, every carefully worded interview, it will all look different once the truth of those 41 minutes becomes part of the public record. I want to say something before we reach the end of this, not as an analyst, not as someone who has spent weeks sitting with the evidence in this case, as someone who thinks about what it means to be a person living inside a story that the world is watching from the outside. There is a specific kind of loneliness in knowing something that you cannot yet say, in having received information in confidence that answers the most important question and then being asked to go back out into the world and continue performing. Uncertainty for an audience that needs to believe the situation is still open. That loneliness does not get named very often in coverage like this. It gets translated into composure, into strength, into the kind of public grace that generates admiration. But underneath the composure, there is a person who woke up one morning and found blood on a front step and has been living with them. Weight of everything that detail implied ever since. Savannah Guthrie has been carrying that weight in front of cameras for 62 days. And the grace with which she has done it should not be mistaken for the absence of what it is covering. It is covering something enormous, something that does not resolve cleanly, something that requires a particular kind of strength that most people will never be asked to find. The case is still open. The investigation has not ended. The people who know what happened in those 41 minutes are still out there making decisions every day about whether silence is still the safer choice. And the evidence, the pacemaker data, the wallet, the removed camera, the behavioral profile of a pre-surveilled targeted operation is still sitting in files waiting for the moment it can be attached to a name. Something does not add up. It never did. And the question that stays open long after this video ends, the one that I keep returning to no matter how many times I try to set it down, is not about the evidence. The evidence points clearly enough. The question is about the person or people who planned those 41 minutes carefully enough to believe the silence would hold, and whether they understood when they built that plan that the one thing they could not account for was a family that refused to go quiet, because silence only wins when both sides choose it, and the Guthrie family made a different choice. Every single day for 62 days, they made a different choice. And that choice, that sustained, exhausting, deliberate refusal to let this story become another quiet file in another open case drawer may be the thing that eventually makes the difference between a case that closes and one that disappears. Notebook versed. Thank you for watching, for staying with this case through every detail, every timeline, every question that does not have a clean answer yet. Before you go, I want to leave you with something simple. Not a conclusion. The evidence has not earned a conclusion yet. Just a thought. The people who planned those 41 minutes believed that careful enough was the same as safe enough. They believed that a constructed narrative held together long enough becomes indistinguishable from the truth. But there is one thing that careful planning cannot neutralize. It cannot neutralize the people who loved the person at the center of it. And those people are still here. Still showing up, still saying the name. If you have any information related to the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, the Pima County Sheriff tip line is 520-351-4900. The FBI line is 1-800-CALL-FBI. The family is offering a reward, and the FBI is offering $100 for information leading to her recovery or to the arrest of anyone involved. Someone out there knows something. The question has never been whether they know. The question is whether they are ready to decide that what they know is too heavy to keep carrying alone. There is a question that serious. Investigators ask in cases like this one that almost never makes it into public coverage. It is not about the crime scene. It is not about the timeline. It is not about motive in the way most people think about motive, as a single, clear reason that explains everything that followed. The question is simpler than that, and more uncomfortable. Who benefited from the story being about a ransom? Not who sent the demand, not who created the wallet, but who, in the broadest possible sense, needed the investigation pointed at a Bitcoin address instead of somewhere else. Because misdirection at this level does not happen accidentally. It is constructed. It has a purpose, and the purpose is always the same: to create enough distance between the investigation and the truth, that the truth becomes unreachable before anyone realizes they were looking in the wrong direction. This is where the case stops being about evidence and starts being about architecture, because when you step back from the individual details, the pacemaker, the camera, the wallet, the 41 minutes, and you look at the shape of the whole thing, what you see is not a crime that was executed and then covered up. What you see is a crime that was designed with its own cover built into it from the beginning. The ransom narrative was not an afterthought. It was load-bearing. It was the structure that everything else was meant to rest on, and it held for 62 days in the most scrutinized media environment in the world. That does not happen without sophistication. That does not happen without someone who thought carefully about how investigations move, how public attention works, how long a constructed narrative needs to hold before the window for immediate discovery closes. And that level of thinking, that particular combination of patience and calculation and operational awareness, is itself a behavioral signature. It tells you something about who you are looking for even before you know who you are looking for. But something about the sophistication of the construction has been consistently underweighted in public discussion of this case. People have focused on what went wrong for the perpetrators, the pacemaker data, the convergent expert conclusions, the watched wallet that never moved. And those things matter enormously. But it is equally worth examining what went right for them. For 62 days, the primary investigative framework in the public conversation was ransom recovery. For 62 days, the most visible element of the case was a Bitcoin address. For 62 days, the question being asked most loudly was not who targeted Nancy Guthrie or why. It was whether the money would move. That is an extraordinary achievement of misdirection, and it deserves to be named as such, because the people who built that narrative understood something fundamental about how cases like this develop in the public eye. They understood that the first story is the hardest to dislodge, that once an investigation is framed around a specific theory, ransom, negotiation, a financially motivated crime of opportunity, that frame becomes the lens through which every subsequent piece of evidence is interpreted. Evidence that fits the frame gets emphasized. Evidence that does not fit gets set aside as an anomaly, explained around, treated as a complication rather than a correction. The pacemaker data did not fit the ransom frame, and for weeks it was treated as exactly that, a complication, something to be explained rather than something to build from. And what happened next was that the professionals who were not bound by the public narrative started saying so, one by one, in their own words, using their own professional frameworks, until the weight of 8 independent convergent conclusions became impossible to set aside as a complication. Harry Trompetus was first, then Bringwell, then Dabb, then Wright, and with each voice the ransom frame lost another structural support, until what remained was not a theory about a kidnapping for profit, but a question about a targeted operation with a motive that the evidence has not yet named publicly, but that 8 professionals believe they understand. This is where things get very quiet in a way that feels significant, because the motive question, the why underneath all of this, the reason someone decided that Nancy Guthrie specifically was the answer to whatever problem they needed solved, is the one element of this case that has not been discussed openly by the professionals who have gone on record. They have talked about the method, the coordination, the pre-surveillance, the operational profile. They have talked about what this was not: a ransom kidnapping, a crime of opportunity, a random act. But none of them have said publicly what they do believe the actual motive was. And that silence, that specific, careful, professional silence around the question of motive, is itself a data point. Investigators do not avoid the motive question because they have not thought about it. They avoid it publicly because naming a motive publicly before an arrest has been made creates legal complications and investigative risks that can compromise a case. Which means the silence around motive is not the silence of uncertainty. It is the silence of strategy, the same kind of strategic silence the family has been maintaining, the same kind of careful, purposeful restraint that characterizes every public-facing element of an investigation that knows more than it can yet say. And sitting with that recognition, understanding that the silence around motive is as meaningful as the silence of that Bitcoin wallet, brings you to the edge of the question this entire case has been building toward from the beginning. Not who. The evidence is pointing somewhere on that question, even if it cannot point there publicly yet. Not how. The operational profile has been reconstructed with enough precision by enough professionals that the broad outlines are clear. The question this case has always really been about is the simplest and most human one. Why would someone decide that this was necessary? Why would someone look at an 84-year-old woman who went to bed tired on an ordinary night and decide that she needed to be the answer to whatever question they were asking? That question does not have a forensic answer. It has a human one. And human answers to questions like that almost always live in the history between people, in relationships, in grievances, real or imagined, in the particular way that someone who feels they have been wronged or who wants something they believe they cannot obtain through ordinary means eventually arrives at an extraordinary decision. I am not naming a suspect. The evidence has not earned that, and neither have I. But I am saying that the shape of this crime, the patience of it, the specificity of it, the personal quality of choosing this particular woman on this particular night through what appears to have been weeks of preparation, does not suggest a stranger. It suggests someone for whom this was not random, someone for whom Nancy Guthrie was not a target of convenience, but a target of intention. And that intention, whenever it is finally named publicly, whenever the investigation reaches the stage where what 8 professionals believe privately becomes what the public record confirms, will reframe this entire 62-day story one final time. Every detail will mean something different. Every silence will carry a different weight. Every carefully worded statement from every person connected to this case will be read through a new lens. That moment has not arrived yet, but the architecture of this case suggests it is coming. Cases built on constructed narratives do not hold indefinitely. The sophistication that makes them effective in the short term becomes a liability over time because sophisticated construction leaves traces. It requires decisions. It requires coordination. And every decision, every coordinated action, every person brought into the knowledge of what actually happened. Each one is a potential point of failure for the silence. Something does not add up about how confident the people responsible for this appear to have been in the durability of what they built, because the most carefully constructed narratives in cases like this eventually meet the same thing. Not better investigators, not more evidence. The thing they meet is time, and the particular quality of time in an open federal investigation with 8 professionals publicly aligned on a single conclusion, and a family that has refused every invitation to go quiet. That quality of time is not neutral. It does not pass without accumulating pressure, and the people sitting inside the silence of this case, the ones who know what happened in those 41 minutes and have been making daily decisions to stay quiet, are feeling that pressure whether they acknowledge it or not. Let me tell you what I think, not as an investigator, not as someone with access to the evidence files, but as someone who has spent a long time thinking about why people do the things they do and what it costs them to live with those decisions afterward. The hardest part of carrying knowledge like this is not the fear of being caught. Fear is manageable. Fear has an object. You can orient yourself around fear and make decisions that address it. The hardest part is something quieter and more corrosive. It is the way that knowledge about what you have done, or what you know someone else has done, changes the texture of ordinary life, the way it shows up in moments that have nothing to do with it, the way it makes certain conversations impossible, the way it creates a distance between you and everything that used to feel normal, that cannot be closed because the thing creating the distance cannot be removed. People who carry knowledge like this for extended periods do not carry it cleanly. It accumulates weight. It changes them in ways that become visible to the people closest to them, even when the knowledge itself remains hidden. And that visibility, that slow, accumulating behavioral change in someone sitting on something enormous, is often what eventually creates the crack in a silence that seemed sealed. The investigation is patient. The evidence does not expire, and the people who know what happened in those 41 minutes are not living as freely as the silence might suggest. Every investigation has a moment where the evidence stops accumulating and starts converging. This case has reached that moment, and the people closest to the investigation know it. Cases built on constructed narratives do not hold indefinitely. The sophistication that makes them effective in the short term becomes a liability over time. And the people sitting inside the silence of this case are feeling that pressure, whether they acknowledge it or not. 8 professionals. One conclusion: a pacemaker that went silent at 2:28 in the morning. A wallet that never moved. A family still showing up, still saying the name. Something does not add up. It never did. And the question that stays open long after this video ends is not about the evidence. The evidence points clearly enough. The question is about the person or people who planned those 41 minutes carefully enough to believe the silence would hold, and whether they understood when they built that plan that the one thing they could not account for was a family that refused to go quiet. Because silence only wins when both sides choose it. And the Guthrie family made a different choice every single day. And that choice may be the thing that eventually makes the difference between a case that closes and one that disappears. Notebook V. Thank you for watching, for caring enough about a woman you never met to spend this time with her story. If you have any information related to the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, the Pima County Sheriff tip line is 520-351-4900. The FBI line is 1800. Call FBI. The family is offering a reward, and the FBI is offering $100 for information leading to her recovery or the arrest of anyone involved. Someone out there is sitting with something they have not yet said, and Nancy Guthrie's name will keep being said for as long as it takes. Notebook versed. We do not just tell stories, we question them. And this one is not finished yet.